At the time I'm recording these words, it's been more than 266 days since Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. In the past few months, the war's momentum has swung dramatically in Kyiv's favor, amid a Ukrainian counteroffensive that has Russian troops retreating from areas that Moscow formally annexed only recently. HIMARS, ATACMS, a dispute over a missile that landed in Poland and killed 2 bystanders. A so-called partial mobilization in Russia that has flooded the Kremlin's invasion forces with poorly motivated draftees as the winter weather looms. What are these things? How significant are these developments? And what could happen next? That's the subject of this week's show. Welcome to the Naked Pravda. Howdy, folks. Welcome back to the Naked Pravda. I'm your host, Kevin Rothrock, the managing editor of Medusa's English language edition, and today's episode is a kind of idiot's guide to the current state of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'll be your idiot today, like usual, and our guide is none other than military analyst Rob Lee, a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, FPRI, who's been meticulously gathering operational data about the war since before Russian troops even started pouring over the Ukrainian border. You can find Rob's work at FPRI's website and outlets like War on the Rocks, and especially on Twitter, if it still exists by the time you're listening, where he has well more than 500,000 followers. Before jumping into today's interview, allow me to remind listeners that Medusa now relies on contributions from our international audience to sustain our work. Every day, millions of people from Russia and other countries read our news coverage. Even though they're now based abroad, our journalists obtain exclusive information about what goes on behind the closed doors of the Russian authorities. In English, our team delivers Medusa's most important stories and reaches thousands of journalists and professionals all over the world with a special newsletter and podcast. This one, in fact. So please visit our website to make a one-time or recurring donation and tell your friends and colleagues about our fundraising if you can. So on today's show, I asked Rob to explain the weapons that have powered Ukraine's counteroffensive, what Russia's recent retreat from Kherson could mean for the invasion's future, and how airstrikes against critical civilian infrastructure across Ukraine affect its national defense capabilities. That and more in the interview. Now here it is. What is so special about high mobility artillery rocket systems, these HIMARS or HIMARS? Is it HIMARS or HIMAR?
HIMARS.
HIMARS. So why are they so special? The way they're described in the media is like, this is manna from heaven for Ukraine. It's basically flipped the war for them. My goodness, they're unstoppable now. Like, what's the thing with these weapons?
HIMARS are a multiple launch rocket system, but they have guided munitions. And like a lot of stuff the U.S. produces, it's very accurate, right? And so I don't know, I forget the circular probable is, but it's if you fire one of these things, it's likely going to hit a target. I believe it's GPS guided. And so when we talk about weapon systems, different wars, certain weapon systems will be more useful than others, and some wars than others, depending on conditions. And so we talk about HIMARS. HIMARS are really effective for a couple of reasons. One, Ukraine is using them well, right? So that comes to them first. Two, the Russian military is particularly vulnerable to this because they have a very centralized logistics system, command and control. That means that they have to have large fixed positions closer to the front lines. And anything within, I think Gimbal's range is like 75, 80 so kilometers. If Ukraine knows where a target is, right, they have the GPS coordinate for it, they can destroy it with the Gimbals, right? They can hit it, very, very reliably. So part of this comes down to the way the Russian military operates. They are particularly vulnerable to this, particularly for artillery, right? We know they use a large amount of artillery, particularly in the Battle of Donbass. And so they have a very centralized kind of logistics system to move that artillery, or a lot of this kind of like industrial scale warfare. How many rounds can you move to artillery batteries every day so they can get replenished, so on. And so because of that, Russia had a lot of arms depots. When HIMARS arrived at the end of June, the first targets they went after was, high-level command and control or these kind of ammo depots. And the ammo depots, the Ukrainians know where they were. And then once they got HIMARS, now they can hit these targets because they have a longer range kind of system that's very, very accurate. So that's part of it. Part of it, too, is that Ukraine has access to U.S. intelligence, right? And so it's not just the Ukrainian military fighting with their own intelligence capabilities, it's the U.S. intelligence community locating targets for them. So there are a number of division-level headquarters of the Russian military that are destroyed by HIMARS strikes. It wasn't stated explicitly, but it's certainly possible that the U.S. intelligence was picking up on some of the kind of the SIGINT or other things, picking up on locations for these command and control nodes, giving that to Ukraine, and Ukraine was targeting them with HIMARS. It was reported back in, I think, March or April that the reason there were so many Russian generals getting killed was because the U.S. was providing intelligent data on where Russian command posts were. This is before HIMARS arrived. Once HIMARS arrived, right, they have an even more accurate system that can hit at deeper ranges. So that's part of it too. And also, keep in mind, HIMARS arrived 4 months into the war, and so by that point, the Russian Air Force failed to achieve air superiority. Ukraine's air defenses, right, they're critical to the HIMARS success because basically Russia has a very limited ability to hit targets beyond the front lines, accurately, because UAVs get shot down, so they can't locate targets very well. And the Russian aircraft can't operate, beyond the front lines very close because they get shot down too. And so they have very limited ability to interdict things. That means HIMARS, which are very fast, very mobile, and very accurate, can move quickly, launch some extremely accurate munitions, and then it can immediately move, displace, and move somewhere else. That makes it extremely difficult to target unless you have some kind of persistent aviation coverage there, which Russia can't achieve. So it's basically a variety of things coming together that make HIMARS effective. HIMARS are a good system as they are, but it's all these other factors that made them have such a kind of larger role than other kind of systems in this conflict.
Is this their greatest success story, or have they been used to similar success in other conflicts?
So the U.S. will use HIMARS in Afghanistan. I think they use it in Iraq, I assume, as well. And then the older variants, the M270, it's a tracked version of the HIMARS, but it's also a kind of multiple launch rocket system, which Ukraine has some of those now. Those have been in service for a long time. They were active in Desert Storm as well. I don't know enough of the history to say overall, but clearly in Ukraine, right, when they arrived, they had an immediate effect. And when they arrived the end of June, I think the first video we saw was June 24th. And then basically Russia's offensive of the Donbass, it very much relied heavily on having a huge quantitative advantage in artillery fire. So every day, right, they had maybe some advantages in manpower in the Battle of Donbass in local areas, but most of the things didn't have that much advantage in. It was really artillery. They were firing so many more rounds a day than what Ukraine could muster that kind of had that as they achieved the success they did then. And so when HIMARS arrived, it basically significantly reduced that ability, reduced the number of rounds Russia could fire each day. And then we've seen more recently, after they went through the really kind of important targets, the last couple months, we've been seeing HIMARS take part in counter battery fire, so that they're targeting Russian artillery systems, like higher level systems,
as opposed to the command and control and the ammo.
Yeah, because basically they have a target list, right? So they're the top priority targets. Most of those things get destroyed, right? Mm-hmm. Russia's learned either any targets within Gimler's range near the front has either been destroyed or has been moved beyond that range.
You said Gimler. What is Gimler?
Gimler's is the munition the HIMARS fire.
Okay.
So it'd be HIMARS, Gimler's range, interchangeably, basically. And so anyway, they've been very effective, but effective for a variety of reasons. And another thing more recently is that Ukraine now, much of the artillery is NATO supplied. So it's 155 millimeter howitzers. Some of it is U.S. M777s, which are towed howitzers. France, Germany, a number of other countries provide different versions, Poland as well. And more recently, the U.S. has been providing Excalibur rounds. So Excalibur are precision-guided munitions. So unlike just normal dome artillery, where it just takes you a couple rounds firing on a target to adjust it until you actually hit the target itself, Excalibur, if you have the drift coordinate for a target, it will hit it right away. And so that's also been a significant development because Ukraine can fire fewer rounds to destroy targets, and that's quite useful and important.
And is one of these rounds cost as much as a cruise missile? Are these $1 million rounds, or is it not? Is it not that expensive?
I forget the exact cost. I think it's we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, not millions.
I see, but they are precision guided, so
this can be either GPS guided, so you give it a grid coordinate, it strikes that coordinate, or it can be something where you use a laser to aim it. Right, so a UAV or aircraft points a laser at a target, and then the munition hits wherever that laser is pointing. Right, so different types of kind of guidance. I'm not the best expert on this stuff, so I'm not the right guy to talk to. But basically, what it means is, in a lot of these artillery duels, especially in Kherson over the summer, you'd see the Ukrainians would locate a Russian vehicle or something, they see it driving, and they start firing artillery at it. But if it's driving, right, it's very hard with unguided artillery to hit a target that's moving on the first round, unless you fire a large amount of rounds and you use kind of cluster type munitions. And so there are a number of engagements over the summer where Ukraine was firing targets and they just weren't hitting, right? And expending numbers of ammunition to do so. Whereas now, if you have Excalibur rounds, once the target stops, right? If you know the grid or you can laser target, it's going to be destroyed. Very, very likely chance. So it removes some of the logistics problems for Ukraine because they can achieve first round effects. And a lot of these, previous fights or artillery duels, they might not hit a target and, spend dozens of rounds, not having success. So, I mean, it's a huge advantage.
So you said that the Russian military's sort of posture in the invasion of Ukraine made it uniquely or just especially vulnerable to these HIMARS weapons, these Gimli? No, not Gimli. That's Lord of the Rings.
Gimlar. This is
Gimlar.
LRS, I think.
Okay. So these particular weapons, they were very vulnerable to those. Are there other American or NATO weapons out there that would presumably also really tip the scales extra, I guess? Like I know I've seen the Ukrainian military and government would love to have the ATACMs, Army Tactical Missile Systems, or even F-16 fighter jets.
Yeah, ATACMs. So ATACMs can also be launched by HIMARS. The benefit basically is longer range and it's a bigger warhead. Right. So depending on what target you want to destroy, if you want to destroy a bridge, so Ukrainians use GIMLRs on the bridges across the Dnipro all over the summer, and ultimately, they basically disabled them, but it required a number of strikes basically to do so because they could punch in kind of small holes, and bridges are quite well built. ATACMs would be more effective at that. There's a bigger warhead, and again, it's the range. So basically, all of those important targets that Russia has moved beyond GIMLR's range, right? Since Ukraine got HIMARS, well, all that stuff, ATACMs can hit anything, can hit basically any part of Ukrainian territory is occupied by Russia right now, right? So anything is open. That includes Crimea, pretty much everything in Crimea. That includes all the Donbass elsewhere. And so basically, it would mean it'd be very tough for Russia because they would not have any safe areas, right? Or comparatively safe areas to use for logistics, for command and control, so on. So, I mean, ATACMs would have a big role. Part of the issue is that when the Biden administration provided HIMARS at the beginning, they explicitly said, we're not providing ATACMs because of escalatory risk, I think. I forget the exact phrasing, but they made it clear they're not providing ATACMs because ATACMs, could be more likely to be used hitting targets in Russian territory, not Russian occupied territory, but actual Russian territory. And then basically they were kind of saying, we're not trying to escalate this conflict. And so I think that was the kind of balance they drew. And so now it becomes the issue of if the U.S. provides ATACMs, what signal does that send to Russia? And again, ATACMs would be effective, but I think because the Biden administration made such a big deal that they were concerned about escalation risk in the beginning, if they provide them now and nothing's changed, then it becomes a question of, okay, what signal do you send to Putin? And of course, the Biden administration is concerned about ultimately escalation risk with Putin because, it seems Bill Burns is meeting with Sergei Narishkin about not using nuclear weapons and things of that nature. So ATACMs would be effective. Certainly, you talk about fighter aircrafts because fighter aircrafts, the U.S. provided anti-radiation missiles to Ukraine.
What is an anti-radiation missile? I saw that and I thought
it goes after radar.
Okay. You fire it at a place that has a radiation, it goes away. It sounds like an amazing missile.
Yeah. No, so it's when radar turned on, they emit a certain signal, and basically these missiles can hone in on that as long as that signal is being emitted. That's why a lot of times you don't keep radar on all the times because you don't want them to be kind of located. So those were immediately effective. They were somehow the U.S., the Ukrainians, they jerry-rigged it so MiG-29s could use them, which was not previously possible. Certainly, if you provide F-16, so a more modern fighter, it can come with a whole suite of capabilities that they don't have right now, and probably long-range munitions. But again, it comes back to the U.S. still saying we are concerned about escalation risks. We don't want to provide Ukraine with weapons that can strike deeper into Russian territory. That comes back to that, whether or not they'll provide them or not. So for the most part, Ukrainians having success. They're having success with what they have. A lot of the things that would be useful. So air defenses, right? I've been talking about that a lot just because that's how you protect Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. And part of this comes back to just, Ukraine's economy, right? Can Ukraine's economy continue to operate? It seems Russia's trying to make that not the case, right? It's a kind of asymmetric response to an inability to kind of respond to Ukraine's advantage on the battlefield. So air defense is obviously a big one. If they're not going to provide long-range systems, there's things like tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, like more modern systems. So when Ukraine is attacking, they have better troop protection or better kind of equipment to use. So things of that nature. I'm not sure what the entire Ukrainian shopping list is, but again, Ukrainians know what they need and they're asking for it. And so it's, basically they've proven in Kharkiv and elsewhere, they know how to do offensive operations. They can do this successfully. If they're asking for something, it's because they know that's the kind of demand or need their military has, and they know this better than I do.
In terms of those asymmetric strikes on essentially Ukraine's critical infrastructure, it's civilian critical infrastructure, its economy, basically, as you said. Do you see any impact on Ukraine's ability to resist the invasion? Or I mean, because that's often described in the media, it seems as oh, they can shut off the lights, but they can't break Ukrainians' will. And it's like, okay, I'm sure that is the case, but also, I mean, without electricity, can they have an economy? Can they? I mean, they have to feed themselves and so on. Like, do you see direct impacts yet of these strikes against power plants and water treatment facilities and so on?
Yes, I mean, short answer, I don't know. I'm not an economics expert, so I'm not sure how well, economically Ukraine can sustain the conflict. That's obviously an important consideration. I say, basically, it doesn't have a that much of direct military effect, right? And so again, we're seeing they've been doing this kind of campaign since early October when Sorovikin was appointed. They have enough missiles to do basically big kind of launches once every couple weeks, right? And that's what we've been seeing. Where they had the big strike early on when Sorovikin was appointed, and then like a week or two later, you'll see, the same thing, like 50, 60 missiles launch. But on a daily basis, it's not that high. And so Ukraine now has some new air defense systems. So some of the NATO stuff's arrived. I think that, yesterday, I think Secretary Austin said one of the systems in Kyiv has a 100% intercept record so far. I don't know, right? And Ukraine makes claims about like shooting down like 80% of the missiles every day. I honestly have no idea if the data is
Is
right.
that the consensus now on the quality of missile defense? Because I mean, I remember reading about it in the '90s, and what I understood the consensus to be was stuff doesn't work that well, but now it's great.
Uh, yeah, I mean, I don't know, right? And so the data stuff is hard to tell. Obviously, Ukraine shoots down some things. Cruise missiles and ballistic missiles are different. So cruise missiles fly at low altitude and they're relatively slow. So that's why you see videos of them all the time where people will post videos. That means, right, air defense systems can shoot them down, right? If it flies over you and it's not a stealthy system, it's potentially you can shoot those down with short range air defense systems. Ballistic missiles are more difficult because they fly at a ballistic trajectory and they come down very fast. And so that's why mostly kind of the air defense systems that we build, like I think Patriot is mostly designed for ballistic missiles. I think that was true for a lot of the Russian systems too, the air defense systems. So one of the concerns is that, right, there's been talk about Iran providing surface missiles to Russia. Obviously, they'll be using these UAVs, like these Shahed 136, which have been, relatively effective, although, you can shoot those down because they're slow moving, they're very loud, they're pretty big, so you can hit those. If Iran provides ballistic missiles, that will be a different, kind of threat to in Russia's kind of air campaign. So that would be an issue. But yeah, I mean, I expect these kind of cheap bombing campaigns, they can make the war more costly, they can make it more terrible. They typically don't change the outcome that much, I think, especially in this case, if it's trying to go after Ukraine's economy. The Ukrainian military right now is supported by NATO. As long as it continues to receive NATO support, NATO ammunition, so on, the Ukrainian military is going to keep, they're not going to lose, right? At a minimum of that. They'll probably keep, gaining more ground. They have a lot of advantages. How the civilian stuff factors in, I don't know. But, as I said, it doesn't seem Ukrainians have any desire to give up on this war. I think when they had their power knocked out, it just makes them kind of angry at Russia, and they kind of want to win the war even faster. And so that seems to be a consensus that I see, is that Ukrainians want to win this war. They see in Kharkiv and Kherson, they see the scenes where they liberate villages. All these villagers are happy to see Ukrainian troops come in. We hear about all the kind of stuff that was committed by Russian troops in those areas. It's a very strong motivation for Ukraine to not, leave any of these territories in Russian hands, given what we see every time when they liberate a village.
Right, right. Do you see the Ukrainian counteroffensive hitting a wall anywhere short of the Russian border? I mean, you mentioned before that the United States has been reluctant to supply these ATACMS, which could reach Crimea, but Crimea is obviously occupied territory as well, but it has a kind of special status because the West basically put up with it or looked the other way for 8 years or whatever it was, and Russia seems to value it more than they do, say, Kherson, certainly. So do you see the Ukrainian counteroffensive stopping at some point short of total victory, and how would that play out?
The short answer is I don't know.
Yeah,
I think we're all kind of making predictions on a level of uncertainty, and it's important to kind of factor that in. So part of this comes down to the amount of support that Ukraine gets. Right. So some people, there were comments yesterday saying there's very unlikely that Ukraine will take back all of Crimea. Well, maybe that assumes the current level of support. If Ukraine started getting ATACMS or other kind of systems, they would have a better chance of taking back all of Crimea, right? And then if they lose some of this kind of support, then it'll be less likely to take back more terrain. they get the kind of continued support that they're getting right now, they have every reason to think they'll take back more territory. When you look at the Russian military, one thing that's hard to kind of tell is increasingly involuntary force, right? So, began on February 24th with almost all volunteers, right? The volunteer military, Rosgvardia, the professional units from the LDNR proxies, right, which are essentially part of the Russian military. And then as the war's gone on, those units took heavy casualties. And so it became, okay, they mobilized the men in the occupied areas of the LDNR areas. And they started pointing them back in like March or April, like early on. And then Wagner started taking it apart, right? They started accepting volunteers, all these short-term volunteers to sign up 3-month, 6-month contracts, right? Get no training, get deployed. And then basically, by August or September, when Ukraine started to have these, successes, the Russian military wasn't that professional. It was, even professional military units, they had these kind of short-term volunteers or other kind of guys who were fighting for them. Wagner's now using, prisoners who've done any sorts of things. And not to mention now, they're mobilizing Russian citizens. And so basically the force fighting for Russia now is increasing involuntary one, because it's either guys who can mobilize short-term contracts who are not allowed to basically in their contracts, or like stop loss, or all these refuseniks, guys in like to me March or April who said, you know what, I'm not fighting anymore, which was a not insignificant percentage from like some of the anecdotes I've seen. Those guys now have criminal penalties, they don't fight, right? So all these kind of things have meant that, okay, now you have a lot of, you have larger manpower, but it's not the most willing manpower. And then when you get in the winter, when the weather is poor, the gap between units that have good morale and discipline and units that don't have that becomes even starker, right? And so when you look at kind of going in the winter, the big weakness for the Russian military now is manpower. It's been manpower basically the entire war. Different things going on, but basically the manpower. On the Ukrainian side, you have a, at this point, equally or better trained military, right? So whatever advantages Russia had on February 24th, well, now you have a lot of guys who had minimal training who are fighting for them. Ukraine has better morale, better leadership. They have all these kind of advantages militarily, and they have better precision fighters, right? With HIMARS and other kind of native artillery, and they've experienced doing this stuff, right? And of course, every time they achieve success, they get more momentum, right? It's a morale boost. It's the opposite effect for Russian troops, where it's, if you're a mobilized guy who's sitting in a trench in Kherson in January, like what are you doing there, right? Is Kherson that culturally, politically important to you as a Russian? Like, I don't know. It doesn't seem that it really is that important. And of course, what is Russia's goals at this point? Just to not lose more? It's like, well, I don't know. I think if you're a mobilized guy, you're not well equipped, you're not well trained, you get thrown right into the fight. You don't know what the goals are. It's cold out, right? All sorts of problems here. And so when we come back to it, part of the discussion is if Russia keeps holding and the military does not collapse, right, it will take time for Ukraine to take more territory. I think the war will go still into 2023, right? Most likely go to the summer at least. There is certainly a possibility that the Russian military at different levels kind of collapses, right? Not even Russian military, it's the force fighting for Russia. I don't know when that would be, or I don't know what the breaking point is. But it is certainly something that's possible, given that the force is increasingly unmotivated and just the leadership's in poor, and it's just not clear what they're fighting for. And again, do you want to die in some area you don't really care about? It's not really significant for you in a war that you're already losing, where the leadership is terrible and you're cold and you don't have good equipment. It's all these kind of things, right? So anyway, when we talk about like long term, I don't know what the end of the conflict will look like. I'm confident Ukraine will take back more territory. And they have every reason to believe they'll do that. And so there's no reason for Ukraine to negotiate for the time being, because however the war ends, the more terrain they've taken back is better for them, obviously, right? Or at least they're in a stronger bargaining position if they take back more terrain too. So again, I think at a minimum, Ukraine is looking to get back to February 24th borders, right? Or approximation of that. As you said, Crimea is probably this kind of outlier question where it is part of Ukraine. Russia certainly views it differently than they view these other areas, right? I mean, the irony with the whole Kherson thing was Russia said this is legally our territory. We claim it all. And Peskov was saying, oh, the nuclear umbrella applies to, all this territory. And they just abandoned it, right? And it's like, it's just farcical. But clearly, Crimea, Russia will probably look at it differently because it's such a, I'd say, integral part of Putin's legacy, right? Foreign policy, legacy, everything else. Crimea is so central to that. And if you were to lose it, the question would be basically, when you look at Putin's 22 years so in power, well, it's kind of unmistakably a failure when you look at those kind of things on the foreign policy side, not to mention everything else that's already happened. So, yeah, anyway, I don't know how the end will go with that. I certainly think that escalation risks grow if Ukraine threatens Crimea. I also think, the side benefit that if Ukraine makes a continued push towards Crimea, Russia may pull forces from elsewhere to defend Crimea because it's more important, right, than say Zaporizhia or somewhere else. So anyway, I don't have a very strong predictions other than Ukraine's going to take back more territory. I think it's very likely. It's certainly possible that the Russian military faces a significant kind of collapse at some point. I'm not predicting that necessarily, but I think it's possible.
So you see signs of potential collapse, even though my impression of the retreat from Kherson was that they looked to be actually exercising better discipline. They planned it and they did it. It was a less chaotic withdrawal than we've seen from some of the other areas in the path of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And so that seemed to me like, okay, the Russian military is actually adjusting to this, to sort of being on its back feet, and that indicates that they're doing better now, even if they're retreating.
So I guess I focus a couple of things. One is, you're right. I think the withdrawal was well done. There are always kind of suggestions that they lost a lot of equipment or a lot of personnel were getting surrounded. Not much indication of that. Most of the equipment we've seen that destroyed was probably destroyed weeks ago, not necessarily in the aftermath of this. So the withdrawal does look it was done better. Putting Surovikin in charge, I think he's the first real overall commander of the war. That is better for Russia as well. The issue just comes back to they have manpower problems. But one thing keep in mind in Kherson, it was mostly VDV. It was elite units doing the withdrawal, right? And so you had more competent units, more professional units doing this. Whereas other parts of the front, you have a larger number of mobilized units or other kind of not very well trained, not very motivated forces. So the standards we saw in Kherson, and absolutely Kherson was a tougher fight than Kharkiv because, again, the Russian had good forces there and they fought relatively effectively at their level. That's why it took Ukraine time to kind of claw it back and take it back. But yeah, when you look at other parts of the front, if Ukraine is not fighting against those kind of forces, they'll probably have more success. And it's not the VDV I think is going to collapse. It's what if mobilized units or these other kind of volunteer units decide we don't want to fight, we're not happy about the war. Do you have enough VDV units to plug those holes? I don't think they do. So again, I don't think a collapse is the most likely scenario. I think it's a possible one. But ultimately, there are always anecdotes we hear of not necessarily mutinies, but of units who don't want to fight, of units who are complaining to their commanders, of always kind of dissension and problems. And it basically, I think it's very hard to kind of say, okay, here's where the breaking point would be. Here's what we kind of see. What we do see is there are significant morale issues, significant leadership issues, and that can lead to greater cascading effects across the Russian force. But, when or how that would happen, I don't know. And, I try not to make kind of predictions that are that specific because it's mostly guesswork.
I also asked Rob about the recent tragedy in Poland that killed 2 bystanders. Initial reports claimed that the deaths were the result of a Russian airstrike, but it now appears that the tragedy was caused by accidental Ukrainian air defense fire. Rob explained what we know so far about the missile attack.
I'd say the initial photos looked like a S-300 series missile. Both Russia and Ukraine use S-300s, but Ukraine uses older versions. So S-300PT, S-300PS. Russia has some S-300PS systems still in service, like in Tajikistan or elsewhere in the Arctic, but they typically have more modern systems. And the more modern systems have newer missiles, which are different, and you can kind of identify them differently. So the missile that it appears it was an older S-300 missile. The location suggests, right, is more likely this is a Ukrainian air defense missile. Ukrainian officials have been saying for a long time that Russia's been using S-300s in a ground attack role because basically every Russian missile, even anti-ship missiles, they always want to have a ground attack option, right? So they want them to be as adaptable as possible. So they allegedly have been using S-300 missiles to hit targets elsewhere in Ukraine. Mostly, I think that's been in the south or east. I don't think I've seen any reports before they're launched from Belarus, which would have to be the case in this case. Of course, the other question is, would Russia, they still have enough cruise missiles. If they're hitting a target in western Ukraine near the border, would you choose to use one of your more accurate missiles or your less accurate missiles? I would say more accurate. It does seem as though, look, it's been very clear since maybe April or so, the critical things supporting for Ukraine was NATO arms. Right? NATO arms is what allowed Ukraine to sustain this war and to, basically have success. Russia understood that, and they've still decided we're not going to hit NATO countries because we are still concerned about invoking Article 5. We don't want to get into a fight with NATO. So it seems, again, based on now statements from Poland, from the U.S., from elsewhere, most likely this was a Ukrainian air defense missile. One thing to keep in mind is that, missiles, they're not 100% like perfect, right? We launch missiles, even with U.S. missiles, a certain number of them, we're just going to go errant for some reason, right? It happens with any kind of missile. There are examples of Russian air defense missiles that kind of turn around. They hit targets, that landed Short, no surprise that having the S-300 missiles. And again, look, it's Russia's launching missiles at Ukrainian territory. They have every right to try and defend themselves. Ukraine's been asking for new air defense systems. This is an older air defense system. So it's, we talk about culpability. I don't blame Ukraine for this incident. It's a tragic thing that happens because in wars, right? Tragedies happen in war. We don't predict them because you get put in a really terrible situation. So I think it's best to wait and see if there's more information that comes out about it.
Sure. Okay. One of the memes, or one of the things I see constantly on social media, and I guess even from pundits, is that Russia is like down to its last bullet or its last rocket. And that's why they're going to Iran, but even that's tenuous. And really, the war could very well end because they run out of things to fire at Ukraine. Is that how much of an exaggeration is that?
It is exaggeration. So basically, Russia will never run out of missiles because they can produce some. And even with, and some of the missiles have been kind of taken apart, it shows that a lot of the chips on things are very rudimentary. It's not very high tech stuff. And so some of the stuff they can still produce, obviously sanctions having effect, but they can still produce some of the stuff. So they're never going to run out of missiles completely. The question is always, do they have enough missiles to hit, a certain number of targets every day? And they don't. Right? And the number of missile strikes decreased over summer. It became much lower. And then basically in the fall, we see these days where we see, 70, 80 missiles get launched. And then we'll see, very few over the next week or two. Right. And so again, it comes back to they can still produce summer missiles every day. Obviously, the Iranian drones help out because a new kind of, basically use them kind of like missiles. And, they'll continue to, produce a certain number going forward. But certainly the number they had in the beginning of the war, they ate through. And so they can, they have to be more conservative about how many they use at a time.
You've been listening to The Naked Pravda. On today's show, you heard from military analyst Rob Lee, a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, about the current state of the war in Ukraine. Thanks for tuning in. Next week, we'll discuss the political power and public role of oligarch, warlord, and troll king Yevgeny Prigozhin. See you then.